You would.
So I'm really excited to come and represent my, this is actually my dissertation from my study that from receiving my PhD at the University of Texas at Tyler. I've been disseminating the findings throughout the last 9 months, and then I'll be presenting these findings again at the Nursing Education Research Conference in March in Washington. So after that, you've been married to a topic for so long, I'm ready to keep moving forward. So my topic was titled, or my study was titled, Exploring the Relationships Between Moral Distress, Moral Courage, and Moral Resilience in Undergraduate Nursing Students. And so just out of curiosity, how many of you know what moral distress is? Or have heard of it? Probably most of you. How many of you feel like you probably have experienced it? I feel like everyone sort of is nodding their head. So I came from, as Vern said, areas where that was a very frequent thing that happened with moral distress in a surgical trauma ICU and a cardiovascular ICU. And so that's where I kind of had to do some soul searching to see what my passion was, and I wanted to know how and why I was able to sort of move on from those events and kind of have that grit to go through it. And moral courage and moral resilience popped up, and that is sort of where that came from. So just to define them for you, moral distress has been around 3 decades. It was actually coined by philosopher Dr. Andrew Jameson in 1984. He defined it as knowing the right thing to do, but being unable to do so due to a form of constraint. And we know that the literature on it is substantial after 3 decades. And so there's a direction of how do we mitigate the effects of it, and it's just not feasible to think that it's going to go away and be completely extinguished. So the direction of that is cultivating certain traits such as moral courage and moral resilience. Moral courage is really just the capacity of an individual to be able to stand up and speak out and about what is right, and despite a threat against your own moral integrity. And then moral resilience is the newer concept of the 3. It is still currently under construction. But it is basically the ability of a person to sustain or restore their integrity in the face of an adverse event or a setback. So I wanted to look at how do these relate. Does having moral courage and resilience mitigate the effects of moral distress? Do they not? Some other terms that relate are moral complexity, and that just refers to events that emerge that don't fit within the learned rules. So you can kind of see how, as a nursing student, you're being taught one thing, and then you are immersed into a clinical experience where you're sort of being put in the middle of moral dilemmas, and it doesn't fit what you've been taught by a faculty member in the classroom. And then moral residue is something that occurs after moral distress has sort of ensued, and it's those lingering feelings, and it is actually a complete loss of moral integrity, where nurses are no longer acting as a moral agent. A lot of the literature talks about nursing practice being a moral agency, or acting as moral agents. A little bit of background on the problem. Again, moral distress is inherent of the nursing profession. You can see Dr. Jameson came back nearly 3 or 4 decades later, and he also said that it is experienced outside of the nursing profession. Kind of a funny story, when I was defending my PhD, when you go in to defend, you have to have a member of the graduate school present there for you, sort of they're in your corner so that your committee doesn't beat you up. They don't do that. But a lady walked in and introduced herself. I don't remember her name, and she said, I'm so-and-so, and I'm a member of plant biology. And I'm thinking, oh wow, I'm really going to bore her to tears. But after my presentation, she came up to me and said, we have moral distress in plant biology. And so that was very interesting to hear. It is experienced prior to entering the profession. When I became a faculty member, I thought to myself, these students have to be under a form of distress. They are witnessing a preceptor not verifying allergy, not wash their hands. They're being taught all these things and not seeing it be done. So they know the right thing to do, but their form of constraint is a lack of knowledge, lack of competency, certainty, those sorts of characteristics. So I was not surprised to find that in the literature. It has an end result of very detrimental effects that are physical and psychological. It is directly related to turnover of the profession and retention. They are inevitable, like I said, so the focus has to be on how to foster that courage and resilience. The strategies to do so, though, are under construction. We don't really know the best practices on how to cultivate that. So the purpose of mine was to really look at the 3 moral concepts in undergraduate students and find out their relationships. Again, very prevalent. I just want to really emphasize that there was not one discipline in healthcare that doesn't have an article on moral distress. Every ologist, neonatologist, pulmonologist that you can think of experiences it, respiratory therapy, social worker, physical therapy, nursing medical students. There's an abundance of moral distress. So we need to focus on the positive, not the negative. The sources of it actually differ, though, which I found interesting. In nursing students, their moral distress comes from their feeling powerlessness, they're feeling vulnerable, not really a member of the healthcare team, and having a voice, and really being put in those situations where they fear other providers not providing good care. So that's their source. Whereas licensed nurses feel it more from an organizational standpoint. The constraints are staffing, resources, and all the demands of the nurse today. Again, we talked about the post effects. Moral courage, in the most recent literature, it is a notion that is actually teachable. There were studies done where nursing curriculums did high-fidelity simulations that underpinned ethics, and moral courage was actually a virtue that was taught. But the scary part was the students knew their role as a patient advocate, and they knew that they should speak up and about the situation, but when the time came, they chose to remain silent. So even though they know what they should do, they choose to remain silent because of their role. Moral resilience came about in 2017 from the American Nurses Association with a push for how do we create this resiliency and this self-awareness. Dr. Cynthia Rushton is sort of, in my eyes, the expert on moral resilience. She just published a book in 2019, and she has 6 domains that surround moral resilience, and some of those include self-regulation, interrelationships. Now we have an interprofessional team of 10 or more members, and you are going to have a lot of differing moral values amongst those team members. And so you have to be able to sort of self-regulate. If you think about, sort of riding the waves, and when adversity hits or a wave crashes your ship, you have to be able to bounce back and regulate yourself throughout that and navigate that. And another one is self-awareness. One other article did link some socio-demographic factors to the intensity of moral distress, so I did look at those in my study. The theory or framework that I used was Dr. Mary Corley's theory of moral distress. It is one of the originating theories of moral distress because there are not a lot, unfortunately. Despite this substantial amount of research on moral distress, there's not a lot of theoretical frameworks, so we might need to go back to the drawing board. But the constructs in orange, I don't know if they're orange on that screen, kind of reddish, are the ones that were directly measured in my study. The items in blue are sort of those concepts that I talked about as a nurse needing to have in order to be a moral agent. Things like autonomy, moral sensitivity, sense-making, conflict, competency, and certainty. And it basically is a sequence of events. So when a moral dilemma presents itself to that individual, they either have an intent to act and speak up and about and have that courage, or they choose to remain silent and undergo the distress, which has sort of the threefold impact that we talked about on the individual. It has an effect on the patient due to lack of advocacy, and then it has that organizational impact for retention and turnover. Moral resilience was a concept that was not originally part of the theory, but added for this study. So I did a descriptive correlational study via cross-sectional online survey, and it was done at our Texas Tech University Health Science Center amongst our 3 campuses that we have here in Texas. I had a convenient sample size of 125 senior pre-licensure nursing students that were invited, and initially I had a 70% response rate, which is really good. But when the vetting started occurring and eligibility came in, I had 19 that became ineligible, which I kind of want to talk about for a minute because I found it to be significant in my opinion that one of the criterions that I deemed them ineligible would be if they had experienced a death of a family member within the last 6 months. And so you can kind of see how there might be regression between the death of a family member and feeling morally distressed. And so 19 of those students had experienced or had a family member die in nursing school. We always say life happens in nursing school. And 19 of them were ineligible. So that is something that's sort of Hollis's realm, what she's dealing with. 20 opted out of the survey because I measured 3 things using 3 instruments, and nursing students don't have time, and when they started clicking through all the long surveys, they were done and opted out. So I ended up with 45, so it's a small sample. With the G-power analysis though, power level 0.8 and a medium effect of 0.5, I was aiming for around 75. So I asked 4 main research questions. Do nursing students with greater resilience and courage have less distress? Do students with higher resilience have less distress? And then kind of inverse that, do students with higher courage have less, you have to ask all the options. Does moral courage predict moral distress more than moral resiliency? So I had to obtain IRB approval from both institutions of the participants in my school. I've already talked about the definitions, the conceptual definitions of the variables, but they were measured using different instruments. Again, I did do a demographic survey because of the correlation shown there in the literature. Moral courage, I used an instrument or tool known as Moral Courage Scale for physicians, which the name is scary, but when I actually looked at the scale, none of the items had anything to do with the specific scope of a physician, but guess who designed the instrument? A physician. So they were very encouraging to use it in nursing students, but it was only a 9-item survey. Moral distress, I used a single item tool as a thermometer, and it basically was a picture of a thermometer, and they raised the level, or so to speak, the temperature of moral distress that they felt like they experienced during their clinical experiences. Moral resilience, I used the CD-RISC, which you may or may not be familiar with. It is the most widely used resilience scale. But one of the things that's important to understand is that I wanted to look at resilience through a moral lens and not just resilience in general. There's different types of resilience. There's psychological, behavioral, and I wanted to focus on that moral aspect. And so in order to measure what I intended to measure, I added 2 questions to the instrument that were derived from a concept analysis on moral resilience, and I'll show you the results of that here in a little bit. So these are just the instruments, again, that I used, in their reliability of Chromebox Alpha were all greater than 0.8. Analyzing the data, the assumptions were tested with normality. I did use a robust method known as bootstrapping, and that is for correlation analyses so that you can rely on a confidence interval 95%. The descriptive outcomes of my study, the mean age for participant or student was 22.15 years with a standard deviation of 2.79. The participants were primarily female, 41, 91.1% of them. I wanted to know if they had considered quitting nursing school in relation to moral distress, because we hear all the time, nursing students say, this is too hard, I just want to quit. And surprisingly, only 8 of them actually had considered quitting. So even though they say that, now I know they don't mean it. For the main study variables, moral distress, the mean was much lower than that of what the literature had pointed to, with a mean of 2.73 and a standard deviation of 1.9. On the thermometer that was used, the level of that mean is kind of deemed uncomfortable. And that scale went all the way from 0 to 11, and I only have students score from 0 to 7. And so there's a lot of variables that kind of, in my opinion, associate as to why our students are not having high intensity, but they are experiencing it. Moral courage had a mean score of 88.15, and again that scale was 0 to 100, with 100 being the highest, and moral resilience with a mean of 78. So they scored themselves much higher in having moral courage than resilience. So with research question number 1, asking did nursing students with greater resilience encourage report less distress? In a Pearson correlation, the moral courage and moral resilience did have a statistically significant relationship with a p-value of 0.006. Moral distress and moral resilience did not, but you can see how the relationship is a negative one. So as distress decreased, their resilience increased. Do students with higher resilience have less distress? This was not significant, but again, it has that negative relationship. So we know as they become more resilient, their distress goes down. For predicting moral distress and courage, that's sort of what the literature was pointing to, is that courage is more predictive of distress than resiliency, when in fact it is actually not. So running a regression for that, the model only contributed to about 2%, which is very, very low. So in a nutshell, resilience is really more the focus or the contributor or predictor for moral distress than courage. So some more additional analyses, which to me is the most important, is that my study is the very first study to ever quantitatively measure moral resilience. That is a behavior that is hard to quantify. Any behavior is hard to quantify. And so when I added the 2 questions to the CD risk, they, and the analysis showed very good convergent validity. They were good questions to ask. And so one of my next steps is going to be looking at maybe the development of an instrument. One has not come out yet, but I'm sure there is one underway, but that's sort of my plan, because both of the questions alone, and in addition to the original instrument, were all highly significant. Some other things in looking at those socio-demographics, we talked about the age. As the age of the participants increased, so did their levels of moral resilience. And I also asked if any of the students had had a previous degree, and the ones who did also had higher moral resilience. So that was interesting. Some future implications are to, again, like I said, explore the measure of moral resilience so that we can quantify it. I would like for this study to be replicated at a multi-site with a much larger sample so that it can be generalized. A mixed method design, in my opinion, would be very rich, because it would be good to know from a student's perspective what are the sources of their moral distress. What are you seeing in the literature right now? It was things like even their relationship with their faculty, their preceptor, their mentors, all created a source of moral distress. It's not directly patient care. So I think a mixed methods design and getting their verbiage on their sources would be beneficial. Again, the theory used in this study was sort of weakened by the results based upon moral courage and moral distress not having that significant relationship in these participants. And so I think that we need to go back to the drawing board with moral resilience now as a whole and add that, maybe look at some grounded theory work and see how that falls. And then more focus on, we know so much about distress. It's time to move forward and see what are the things we're doing about it, because the landscape is changing so quickly. There's so many demands with patient-centered care that we have to be able to take care of ourselves. And so in nursing curricula, I really fear that ethics are being condensed and reduced and even left out of curriculums. And that's such an important part, because when students get into practice and they're faced with a moral dilemma, they don't know what to do. They don't know who to go to. They don't know what to do. And they're constrained. Mindfulness has been one of the things associated with cultivating moral resilience, as well as self-care. And we always preach to our students, you have to take care of yourself, because when you're emotionally depleted and you're physically depleted, you are going to be more susceptible, and you're not going to be able to regulate yourself and have that awareness when you are not having any resilience or ability to cope when adversity hits. That's all, Cesaria. Conclusions, again, this was the first study that looked at all three moral concepts in relation to each other. Again, the baseline assessment of moral resilience was derived from this, and that's about it. So, questions? Erin? Oh, yes.
Did you have any limitations that you noted with having 3 different scales out there? Was there any limitations with that?
Well, as you can see, 20 students opted out about halfway through. When I was going through my data, I had 20 missing. So those have to be completely deleted because they're not complete data sets. And so that was a huge limitation, because I would have almost met my sample size. So that's why, one of the reasons why I didn't use the moral distress scale, which is a very widely known scale, and I chose the single item just because it was more user-friendly and less long. So that was the biggest limitation. The other things were, I just think that they don't know what those things mean. But on the tools, I did put, moral distress includes examples such as, but not limited to, bullying, unsafe medication administration practices. And I kind of put examples for them, but I really think that they don't know what they don't know. If that makes sense. Does that answer the question? Okay.
So Dr. Gibson and I are going to make this a little more interactive between you and us. First and foremost, I just want everyone to know how proud I am of her. She is a mentor, a best friend, and someone I go to for practically anything in my life, whether it be at work or school. So I'm proud of you, and you're awesome. So this topic is very important in, not just nursing, as Dr. Gibson had mentioned throughout her presentation. So if any of you would like to share maybe a situation of moral distress that you have encountered, and then, as she said, the older students maybe were more resilient. So how did that help you with maybe building resiliency as we learn and we grow? Does anybody have anything that they want to share? Or maybe what happened? So a few examples that she had mentioned in her PowerPoint, of our students, is they are feeling powerless. So in the hospital setting, they don't feel like they can speak up to the nurse, because I really don't know as much as the nurse, but I know they're doing the wrong thing. So how can we teach that? They're unable to act in the clinical setting maybe because they're so distressed. So as professors, how can we build this and help our students with that? Bullying from peers, from even faculty members was also a part of it. So is that something that you think about, as healthcare providers and as professors in the room? How can we help our students with this?
It's funny, we were at lunch today and we came across a former student, and she's just started working, and she actually spoke about a situation, I think it might have been today or recently, where, they had a recent heart surgery patient that had come back, and I guess the graft had failed, and the surgeon was in there just yelling at them, and this was during the night shift. And so most of the nurses on the night shift were fairly new, so most of them had less than 4 years combined experience, aside from the charge nurse. And she was expressing to us how she felt at that moment. She felt powerless. She didn't know what to do. She's like grabbing everything she could with this surgeon just yelling at them. And she said, they don't teach us that in nursing school. And I kind of sat there at lunch, I'm like, we have a communication lecture, but how do we prepare our students to handle situations like that, where they're kind of thrown into an unexpected event where they've got a surgeon yelling at them, and they're in a situation that they've never really been prepared for. But she did feel very powerless, and expressed that to us, and it's so funny that we ran into that today. But I think as faculty, we really need to model that for ourselves, amongst us. We need to model, that spirit of, loving each other and treating each other professionally. And when our students see that, they will want to be the same. So.
And one of the things that goes along with speaking up is assertiveness, and that's really important, as no matter where you work as a nurse, but being the assertive nurse. We always teach our students, assertive nurse is a good nurse, not passive or aggressive or passive aggressive. But that makes the good nurse, because then it's not about you and your values, it's about the patient, and you still know your values, but one of the things Dr. Rushton emphasizes is even if you speak up and about something and nothing is done about it, you are less susceptible to having those feelings of moral distress, because you have done your part and you have spoken up about something. So even if you fear that nothing's going to be done, you still have to speak up about what you think is right. So I'll just...
Yeah, I had experience. I went to School of Covenant, went through all those clinical hours, and never in school lost a patient. Never lost a patient. So I went to work in the ER, and we've been taught all that, Jehovah's Witness, giving blood, doing all these kind of things. I had a guy come in, he was in his early 40s, bad GI bleed, high political shock, bleeding out, doing all this, wife, kids, everybody's there in the ER. And so we're going in, and this guy is dying. He is dying. And I know the easy fix, you give him blood, he's back in the game, and he would not take blood. It was not happening. And I was losing my mind, because I knew what he needed. And everybody, including me, we're going to sit there and watch this guy and do nothing. And so even with all the things that I was told in nursing school and taught in nursing school and everything, there is nothing like that dynamic of being in that situation where it's your patient.
Right.
And I always thought about nursing as one of the most humbling professions in the world, but Erin, after hearing your presentation, I think it's more on that moral distress side. It's the humbling side of it, because we're geared toward, we're going to fix things, we're going to help people,
Right.
and certain values and beliefs and things enter into that equation, and you are helpless. I never felt so powerless in my life.
Right.
And so it was me and the ER doc, and we spent more time, it was more therapy, sitting on the side and said, Terry, stand down. I was talking to the wife, and I said, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
Let's help him. And no, that's just not our belief system.
Right.
And that is just not going to be part of this care.
Right.
And so, and he died. He died. But I'd almost wished that in nursing school at least had a patient pass away where I could at least have something to draw back on, because I was just like, man, whatever. I go home and talk to my other therapist.
Right. you would receive blood and he would not. And you have to be grounded in your own values and be able to kind of set them aside. And that's hard to teach. And that's why I think with experience, resilience and that grit kind of,
A learned behavior
yeah,
Yeah.
over time. I mean,
yeah,
the more you do it or you're more exposed to it, you
right,
just become accustomed to it, or,
right,
I mean, it's kind of hard to teach it until you live it. You can
Right.
tell stories about it, but when you live it, you're like, okay,
Yeah.
And we
right,
tell our students, there's only so much you're gonna learn in nursing school.
Yep.
It's not
Right.
until you actually get out there and start having those real life experiences. It's gonna be hard at first,
Right.
but then, you kind of start living through those and you learn.
yeah,
I was gonna say that too, is like, it's okay not to know everything.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And if a student knows that this is the right thing to do, they could say that. I don't know everything, but my teachers have taught me that we're supposed to wash our hands before we do this,
Right.
whatever the
Right.
issue is. And it's okay that you don't know everything,
Right.
but there's some things you do know.
Right.
And to have that, what you said, that assertiveness, that self-efficacy, that belief, that ability to speak up. And another thought that was coming to mind is Patricia Bender's novice to expert. As we get the more experienced
Yes.
nurse, they're stronger
Right.
in that assertiveness.
Right.
And so you most likely were dealing with novices.
Right.
They're not even registered nurses yet.
right,
So it's a challenging thing to try to encourage them to be that one that would
Yes.
speak up, because many times there are backlash and consequences to speaking
That's
up.
right.
But I believe what you're saying, that if you don't speak up, it's going to affect you more
right,
than if you have the
Right.
courage to speak up and you get chewed out or you
Right.
get whatever.
right.
At least you stood your ground for what
That's
you believed and what you knew.
That's right. And if we're gonna remain the most trusted profession, then we have to continue to do that and not stand down like if it goes to the nurse who got arrested for standing up on behalf of her patient and doing the right thing, I mean, that's why we have to really protect our profession and not, we are a profession, that's what makes us more, we have our own body of science and knowledge and a license, so we want to keep that being resilient one way.
I was just going to add, President Grant at the ANA has made a real goal that we as nurses nurture our own, and that sets the pace for others. Interestingly enough, he came from a fireman's background with a lot of service in community, much like you did, Terry. And he said he noticed all along the way what made the difference in critical moments was that people feel comfortable. And that's almost like we're taught even in interprofessionalism. We do need to respect the importance of one another, and it's easier said than done. But I want to remind us of one person in our past. Dr. Helen Cox did a lot of work on that violence within the realm of hospital setting and where there's the power difference. And her whole thing about verbal abuse became very effective. There were a lot of people who will remember times when in various hospital settings, she would say, when one or more of us is threatened, you get a circle around and you say, this is not acceptable. This will not continue. The students will often see that and they will remember it. And I have seen students stand up to this kind of a situation in the ICUs. And it seems like those kinds of things happen more often in certain settings. They do. And yet it doesn't mean that no one is immune.
Right.
They can happen any place.
Right.
And it's almost like, it's one of the things maybe we don't like to talk about, but it is imperative that we do that. And that's part of content knowledge that maybe we include,
Right.
because everybody's using team steps for communication, but it isn't as objective as people might think. You don't always think to do that. The emotional overtones take over before you have a chance. But it means we have to be the ones, if we're ever in presence of, and help them to know, anticipate such possibilities. And maybe in simulation, we have that luxury to throw that in as another one of those kinds of components. But we care deeply, and I really want to commend you for your choice of topic and your colleague, your esteemed colleague, who is also going to follow in your footsteps. So it means the fact that you care that much speaks volumes.
resilience, because I think everybody in the room would agree, it's frustrating to spend more time educating student nurses than what they last in the career.
Right, for sure.
The half-life.
The half-life of a student, of a graduate. And so that, I just would like to put a big exclamation point on introducing this, how do we help
Yeah.
students survive in this
Right.
career?
Because then if not, then that's where the compassion fatigue and the burnout
Yes.
come from, because they just, I mean, what's the point? Why would I speak up if I continue to meet these constraints? But we have to continue.
Yeah, that's important work, excellent job, excellent.
So Dr. Gibson and I will be working closely together when I graduate to do a few more research studies and putting our topics together, as one of her recommendations is mindfulness. And my project dissertation is mindfulness in nursing students. So I know that's one of our future research. Do you have other research that maybe
Well, I
future
mean,
that you would
Dr.
like to?
Hill and Hollis and myself are working on sort of the next steps, and when one of the things that's coming up and about from Sigma is a push for joy. Joy, like, are we still is that part of the nursing profession? And when we were like, joy, and we looked it up and we found this framework, and one of the dimensions of joy is resiliency. And so that might be the avenue, because we want to stay focused on the positive and not just, it causes all this, and